Donald Trump said Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and now Israeli MPs have passed a new law making it harder for any future government to compromise with the Palestinians. What hopes then for a two-state solution? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. In the words of one Israeli opposition MP, when Jerusalem burns, everything burns. Nahman Shai fears a newly passed law in the Knesset could lead to more unrest in the Middle East. The Israeli law makes it harder to divide the contested capital of Jerusalem in any future deal with the Palestinians. And it reduces the Palestinian population of the city by 1/3. New borders have been drawn up so that several Arab neighborhoods are now outside Jerusalem. It could all have a dramatic impact on any peace deal between Israel and Palestine, with some saying it's yet another fatal blow to the two-state solution. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Mohammed Jamjoom reports from West Jerusalem.
At its core, this new law would require that 80 of 120 Knesset members, or a full 2/3 of the Knesset, would now be required to approve any future legislation that would attempt to divide Jerusalem. Essentially, that would ensure that Jerusalem would remain off of the negotiating table when it comes to any future peace talks. Of course, that would complicate an already very complicated situation. Now, this vote comes on the heels of another contentious vote, a vote that happened on Sunday. This was a vote by the Central Committee of the Likud Party. They voted to annex large portions of the occupied West Bank. Now, the first thing to remember is that that resolution they voted on is not binding. Also, we've not yet heard any reaction from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as to whether he will endorse that resolution and actually try to take it to the Knesset to get it passed into law. But that resolution, after it passed, was causing great consternation and anger amongst Palestinians. Of course, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said that this was considered an aggression against the Palestinian people. Taken together with this new vote, it really shows just how tenuous the situation remains and how uncertain things really are on the ground here.
Well, Jerusalem has so much significance for so many people that it's long been a sticking point in the peace process. Jerusalem became the religious center of Judaism when the Holy Temple was built around 3,000 years ago. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ around 1,000 years later made the city central to the Christian faith, and the city is hugely significant to Muslims too, home to Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest place in Islam. The creation of the nation of Israel in 1947 divided the city. West Jerusalem was deemed part of Israel and the east put under Jordanian control. That lasted until the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israeli troops seized East Jerusalem. That half of the city has been under Israeli occupation ever since, despite the UN declaring the Israeli invasion illegal. Let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. Joining us from Amman in Jordan is Mouin Rabbani, a political analyst and senior fellow with the Institute for Palestine Studies. From Jerusalem, we're joined by Robbie Sabel, a former legal advisor to Israel's foreign ministry and professor of international law at Hebrew University. And also Jeffrey Aronson, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute who specializes in the Arab-Israeli conflict. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Jeffrey, we'll start with you first. This was an amendment to an existing law that the Knesset passed. What do you make of it?
Well, in its practical effect, I think it's left to be determined. I think more importantly, it's a reflection of the absence of any degree of consensus on the part of the major parties that are party to the conflict about how to proceed. In the past, the Oslo Accords, for better or worse, were the framework through which these kinds of issues were being debated, framed, and addressed. With the failure of the Obama administration's efforts to progress on that front, we've seen this is one manifestation of the costs that are being borne by the Obama administration's failure. That is the struggle to determine the diplomatic agenda for the future. And this is a reflection of Israel's attempt to put on the table essentially fait accompli about how to address the city's future in any consensual effort to resolve it diplomatically.
Robbie Sabel, in Jerusalem, human rights groups have warned that what's really going on here is an ethnic cleansing in order to build a greater Jewish Jerusalem. Are they right?
There's no ethnic cleansing. In fact, the Muslim population has grown tremendously in Jerusalem since '67. The issue of Jerusalem is on the table. In the Oslo agreements, we agreed to negotiate it. And as you pointed out in the opening, there are Muslim holy sites. We're aware of them. We're willing to negotiate some special status. It's worthwhile recording that we've already negotiated with the Vatican a special status for the Catholic holy sites. By the way, the PLO did as well. And Israel is willing, and has said that it's willing, to negotiate with the Islamic world a special status for the Islamic holy sites. The law doesn't change anything. It'll make it more difficult to reach Knesset approval for an agreement, but it's worth bearing in mind that this law, like any other law in the Israeli parliament, can be changed by a 61 out of 120 majority. And in the past, by the way, it's worth recalling, there was a law forbidding Israelis to negotiate with the PLO. The moment PLO recognized Israel and began negotiating, we simply repealed the law. So this law, like other laws, can be changed by the Knesset itself.
So you're saying, I mean, the law would essentially become null and void if any agreement is reached on the status of Jerusalem as part of any future deal. So why then did it need amending?
No, but I wouldn't count null and void. One would say it can be repealed, as laws in the past have been repealed. It's a gesture. It's a gesture of the right wing, the coalition agreement government, it's unhappy with the situation, and they're making a declaration. But basically, it's just a declaration. It doesn't change the fact that all Israeli governments have been willing to negotiate the issues.
Okay.
And what we need to do is to simply sit down and negotiate.
Robbie, you say it's a gesture, but again, I come back to that. Why do it,
Yes.
given the inflammatory nature of it? You know, the upset that it was going to cause.
Politicians are politicians are politicians. They have their own constituency. They wanted to make a declaration, but it doesn't change the facts on the ground.
Okay. Mouin Rabbani, in Jordan, what do you make of this? What you've just heard? Is this law an attempt to alter facts on the ground, as far as you're concerned?
Very much so. And I think, as a previous speaker made clear, as far as the Israeli government is concerned, Jerusalem is a purely religious issue for Palestinians, and the only thing that Israel will be willing to negotiate is access for Palestinian Muslims and Christians to their respective holy sites. Whereas, in fact, what's happening here is that Israel has sovereignty, or is claiming sovereignty illegally over all of Jerusalem, and it has illegally occupied and annexed East Jerusalem. And I think this latest measure that it's taken, and additionally the draft or the resolution that was passed by the Likud yesterday, should be seen as Israel seeking to take advantage of the recent American declaration recognizing Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, or rather recognizing exclusively Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem. And I think it's now very much a question for the international community, particularly those who have influence over Israel, and for the Palestinians themselves, to push back and to ensure that further American support for Israel, and presumably American silence on this latest measure, doesn't lead to yet further facts on the ground by Israel.
So you think that these measures are designed to preempt any future peace efforts?
Very much so, or perhaps more accurately, to ensure that any future peace effort or diplomatic process conforms primarily to Israel's vision of what a final disposition of the occupied territories should be. In other words, that all of East Jerusalem, with the exception of some of its Arab suburbs, that the main settlement blocks, the Jordan Valley and so on, that these should all be under, if not permanent Israeli sovereignty, then at least under permanent Israeli control, and that Palestinians should basically be limited to a few Bantustans here and there, and perhaps an independent entity in the Gaza Strip.
Jeffrey Aronson, this bill was first proposed, the amendment to the law was proposed last year. To what extent could it have only gone through the Knesset, though, once US President Donald Trump had recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital?
Well, it was certainly, the American decision is certainly an important factor, but it basically only gave a tailwind to these kinds of efforts, which are proceeding on a track, in a sense, independent of the Trump administration's preferences. We have, again, the consequence of the failure of a consensual framework for diplomatic engagement and an Israeli effort, particularly one mounted by Israel's right wing, to create an agenda that everyone will have to conform or accommodate themselves to. So Trump was certainly not playing chess with himself when he made his historic declaration. But these efforts have been underway for quite some time. There's a history on Jerusalem, going back to 1980, if not earlier. So while Trump was important in crystallizing these kinds of concerns and aspirations on the part of Israel's right wing, they weren't critical to it.
Robbie Sabel, in Jerusalem, this legislation also establishes a new local council for the Palestinian neighborhoods that are now effectively cut off from Jerusalem. What are the implications of that?
Well, I think it's correcting an artificial increase of Jerusalem done in '67 when certain Palestinian Arab villages were attached to Jerusalem. There's no logic to them being in Jerusalem, part of Jerusalem. They weren't part of Jerusalem under Jordanian rule. It also raises an interesting question as whether you can have different regimes in different parts of Jerusalem, which if I was a Palestinian, I would pay careful attention to. As to Trump's recognition, he recognized the reality. All states, in fact, treat West Jerusalem as Israel's capital, including Arab states, including Egypt and Jordan. It was simply recognizing the reality. The final point I would like to make is the Palestinians must sit and try and negotiate with us. There'll be no international regime which will satisfy them or us. We have to sit together and make difficult decisions. We Israelis will have to make difficult decisions, but so do the Palestinians. When I think one can say that when an Arab states have sat down with us and declared that they want to reach a final peace agreement, that is Egypt and Jordan, Israel has proved itself to be very willing to make concessions. But for that, we need a partner willing to sit with us and say, yes, we're going to reach a final peace agreement.
But hang on.
I hope we can do that with the Palestinians.
The member of the Knesset who proposed the bill said at the time that its goal was to prevent concessions as part of any diplomatic deal. Jerusalem will never be on the negotiating table, she said. Jerusalem's the capital of the Jewish people and will remain the capital of the Jewish people for all eternity. The state of Israel will not allow for the establishment of a Palestinian state with its capital in Jerusalem, and that ultimately is what it's all about, isn't it?
It's worthwhile looking at the text. The text did not say Jerusalem, there can be no arrangement. All it said is you need a special majority to approve it. From this one can learn that they do understand that there will have to be some special arrangement. They want to make sure it has a large majority, 80, but even this majority can be changed by a different majority in the Knesset. But in principle, Israel has said in the Oslo Agreement, we will negotiate. There's various issues in Jerusalem, including the religious issue, and we are willing to negotiate. But again, we need a partner saying, yes, we're going to make peace with you, and then we can negotiate.
Mouin Rabbani, what do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I think it's quite clear that what's happening in Jerusalem in terms of hiving off these Arab suburbs, it's basically demographic engineering, seeking to maximize the proportion of Jews and minimize the proportion of Palestinian Muslims and Christians in the city. Second of all, if this is all about recognizing reality, then fine, let's recognize North Korea as a legitimate nuclear power. Let's recognize the legitimacy of the Russian annexation of the Crimea, and we can recognize all kinds of other things under the rubric of we're simply accommodating ourselves to reality. It's quite clear that what's happening now is that Israel is seeking to take advantage of the, on the one hand, unprecedented American support for Israel's extremist agenda, and on the other hand, the unprecedented weakness of not only the Palestinians, but the Arabs more generally, and on the other hand, the growing disinterest and preoccupation elsewhere of other members of the international community to seek to impose a permanent settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through these kinds of realities that it hopes that first the United States and then other prominent members of the international community will recognize. And it's essentially based on permanent control of Palestinian territory and the permanent subjugation of the Palestinian people.
So I just want to, right back at the beginning of that answer, when you were discussing this new law and its implications and the council that's going to be formed, you would agree then or your view is that the establishment of this new council for the Palestinian areas is in effect a prelude to stripping Palestinians of residency and barring them from Jerusalem?
Quite likely. I mean, I think it should be seen as an attempt at demographic engineering to maximize the proportion of Israeli Jews and minimize the proportion of Palestinian Muslims and Christians in the Holy City. And if you first establish this council separate from the existing municipal arrangements and so on, I'm taking it for granted that a subsequent step will indeed be to try to reclassify these areas or suburbs or whatever you want to call them as somehow being outside of Jerusalem, and therefore their residents, like those of the rest of the occupied Palestinian territories, will be in effect banned from entering those areas of Jerusalem that Israel has annexed.
Jeffrey, where does this leave the peace process and the two-state solution?
Well, those are two separate questions. The peace process, as we've come to understand it since the post-73 era is over, it has been for some time. There hasn't been an agreement between Israel and the PLO since 1995, I believe, with the signing of the Oslo II agreement. So it's been quite some time since there's been any measurable, definable progress on the diplomatic front according to the Oslo formula. So in that sense, the peace process is dead. What we see here are efforts to reconstruct some sort of process, but it's based on entirely different principles than the ones that informed Oslo. This one is unilateral, promoted essentially by Israel with effective U.S. support to set a diplomatic agenda defined by Israel and defined by some of the most extreme elements in Israel who were determined to use the rubric of creating facts as the template for creating a new reality that the international community will have no choice but to accommodate. And the response of the Trump administration and their explicit, in a sense, endorsement of this policy of creating facts is a tremendous achievement on Israel's part, certainly in the post-1967 era.
Robbie Sabel, do you want to respond to that?
Two issues. First of all, the Arab residents of Jerusalem will be transferred or moved to a different municipality will remain Israel residents. And in fact, if one wanted to transfer them, let's say to the PA, to the Palestinian Authority, one would need 80 members of the Knesset to do so. So they're not losing their residency. The second issue is what President Trump recognized was a legal reality, not just a physical reality. Every state in the world decides what its capital is. Jerusalem has been Israel's capital for 70 years. It's been recognized de facto by all states, including, as I said, Arab states. Arab ambassadors present their credentials to the Israeli president in Jerusalem, sign treaties in Jerusalem. All states recognize the legal reality that Israel is Jerusalem's capital. However, the issue of East Jerusalem is on the negotiating table. They're difficult issues, and that Israel remains willing to negotiate.
Mouin Rabbani, I know you want to respond to that, but we're pretty short on time here. I want to move the discussion on. What options do the Palestinians have now in the face of this new law?
Well, the international community is extremely clear that Israel's annexation of occupied East Jerusalem is null and void. And the Palestinian priority at this point should be to focus its effort on the one hand, the mobilization of its own people, and secondly, through the re-internationalization of the question of Palestine, to ensure that the illegality of Israel's presence in the occupied territories, including the illegality of not only Israel's measures, but its very presence in East Jerusalem, becomes once again becomes a prominent agenda, a prominent item on the international agenda. So it needs to mobilize its own people and mobilize the international community. And that, I think, will first and foremost require a different and more effective Palestinian leadership than that which exists at present.
Jeffrey Aronson, would you agree with that?
More of the same, only do it better and quicker, certainly.
What about further unrest in the occupied territories? Is there a fear now that this law could lead to that, Jeffrey? I mean, what I'm trying to ask here is, are we heading towards a third intifada, do you think?
Well, we've been describing the potential for a third intifada since the second intifada ended. The fact of the matter is that one hopes that violence and confrontation will be minimized. However, what we see here is the absence of any structures that can contain that kind of outbreak. We don't have a consensual understanding between Israel and the PLO. The United States has not been an effective contributor to creating that kind of consensus. The international community itself is distracted and tired of the Palestine conflict. So we don't see too many mechanisms in place to constrain a degeneration of interaction on the ground. People have already died in these last months, specifically as a consequence of U.S. decisions, and we can see these kinds of actions in the Knesset as only further inflaming the kind of opposition that is currently stirring throughout the occupied territories.
Robbie Sabel, do you want to respond to that? And also to Mouin Rabbani's point about the Palestinian leadership. Would Israel prefer to be negotiating the future status of Jerusalem with a new, more dynamic Palestinian leadership?
It's obviously not for us to decide who the Palestinian leadership is, but I would make the point that there's no point in talking about mobilizing international community, because to a certain extent this is the Palestinian tragedy, feeling that the UN or the international community will negotiate for them. They should look, I think, to the examples of the late President Sadat and the late King Hussein, who sat with us, made difficult decisions, recognized Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, but had hard demands, which we set. That's the only way. There's no other way. The international community is not going to draw borders between us, is not going to make arrangements. The Palestinians have to sit with us, and I understand it's difficult for them to do it, but I'm optimistic that they will eventually do so.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid there we are going to have to end the discussion. Many thanks indeed to all of you, Mouin Rabbani, Robbie Sabel, and to Jeffrey Aronson. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see the program at any time just by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion on this issue, join us at our Facebook page on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian, Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.